Sponsored by Experience Imagination. In my last video, I talked about the basic ROI or return on investment on the animated feature format. So this time, I thought I'd talk about the animated series. There's only one problem. It's kind of dead right now, unless you're in two specific categories. And to find out what those are, stay tuned. Hey there, welcome back to Surviving Animation, your guide to making it in the business of cartoons. My name is Eric Calderon. We are talking about the animated series format, who makes money, how it might be dead, and what are the major exceptions. But before I dive in, I'd like to once again thank my sponsor, Falcons Creative Group, and their podcast, their award-winning podcast, Experience Imagination, which is a themed entertainment podcast. This most recent episode is called Ringling Students Want to Know, and it features students from the Ringling College of Art and Design Entertainment Design Program and their questions about the themed entertainment industry. Those questions are answered by some of Falcon's top brass in the design and media department. So it's really good, a lot of information. If you're new to the themed entertainment world, it's a good way to kind of get the questions that you would ask and find out how us at Falcons will answer it for you. All right, let's get back into the basics of who makes money when an animated series gets made. And to do that, it's important to consider the types of players in the animated series format and the television streaming business in general to understand who benefits and from what perspective they come from. So to do that, we really have to break this down into three specific areas: the creators, the distributors, and the advertisers. Let's start with the creators. This is the easy one because it's the one most people think about when they talk about making cartoons. Well, there's really bad news, unfortunately, about being a creator of a show or the producer of a show. This is the category that makes the least amount of money. So on the bright side, these are actually the folks that get paid first, so that's good, but let's get into some of the details of that. All right, to be honest, most people who come to me and want to talk about the business of cartoons actually sit in the creator side. They have an idea, they have maybe a little bit of development, and they're really just hoping that they can pitch it and that a network will pay for it, and they can have the full production budget paid, and they get to make their show. And for a long time, I think this is how the business of cartoons kind of worked. And there were networks that existed, there were programming slates that had to be filled, and part of the equation was just getting talented creators and animation studios to make shows that would air on these networks that would fully pay for it. But even during those healthier times of the industry, the best one could really hope for was like a 2 to 5 year job, and the creator of the animation studio would have a great time making it, and they would have that moment where they really felt their dreams were come true. But when you break it down, there's only two really forms of profit in the creator side of the business. First is actually the slight production margin on the cost of the animation, and the second is the small net royalty paid back to the creators who actually made the show. To be more specific, an animation studio can expect as little as nothing for just producing a show purely for the cost in order to get the experience and the credit to make more in the future, to maybe as high as 30% for a very highly sought-after team, kind of an irreplaceable talent, or a particular production style that just can't be done anywhere else. But in the worst cases, and I've seen this a lot, the more difficult productions, the less experienced creators, the less experienced teams, or an overpromised premise actually make studios lose money. So those animation studios go in, they have the best intentions, but on the other side, they actually lose more than they make producing the show. So there's a really big and important reason, though, why creators keep coming back to make these shows and why animation studios keep coming back and pitching shows, and that is they don't have any capital. So for creators and production companies, there's basically no risk when it comes to actually producing the show. The production cost is paid for by someone else. You're just kind of touring around, you're taking meetings, and you're hoping, well, someone just go for it and buy my show and you'll win the lottery. But when you're in this position and you have what they refer to as no skin in the game, the rewards will always be heavily, if not 100%, in the favor of the network that pays for it. So on the flip side, just making a cartoon, which is a privilege and an honor for probably less than 10, 20,000 people in the world, is kind of enough. You know, you just are in the business to make cartoons. Maybe you love to draw, maybe you love to write, and you're just going from job to job to job, and you find that you have a career in animation, and maybe that's just kind of good enough. Moving this conversation forward, the next perspective to think about when it comes to who makes money when an animated series gets made are the distributors. And I'll break them into three subcategories: the studios, the networks, and the streamers. What's crazy about this whole section is that the order of magnitude of how much money is made is kind of ridiculous compared to what the creators make. But when you start to realize the risk going in financially, it does kind of make sense. So don't get too disheartened. It'll all kind of net out when I describe it. All right, let's start with the studio. The studio is often confused with the TV network, which is understandable because they're often tied together as one entity, especially in these larger vertically integrated companies. But the studio actually still exists in the classic sense. For example, there's MRC, who created shows like Knives Out and the film Knives Out, Ted, the film and TV series, and Ozark. And there's Legendary Pictures, which made shows like Monarch for Apple, or Lost in Space and Pacific Rim, the live-action and animated versions. Studios use their own capital to put together a TV series pitch, usually with large talent attached, or they use their fully owned IP, like Legendary owns Godzilla outside of Japan, to get a show teed up for sales. If a network or their own network picks it up, then it's negotiated as a licensing deal that allows the network a period of time to distribute. But when that time's out, the rights to distribute go back to the studio. Now, this was classically called syndication. To talk about the cream of the crop of the heyday of syndication, something like Seinfeld, which aired from 98 to 2013, made $3 billion in syndication over its lifespan. That's ridiculous. Then it was sold to Hulu. And when it was on Hulu, it made $1 million per episode for a show that was completed a decade before. And then even after that, Seinfeld was sold to Netflix, which earned it another $750 million. Of course, those numbers will never happen again, but the theory is the same, regardless if it's Seinfeld or if it's a studio who's making millions on its first sale and hundreds of thousands across multiple syndication windows. But what's important to know, and I just want to repeat, that these studios have a combination of cash, clout, and established IP, which allows them to be in this lucrative position. All right, moving from the studios onto the networks, I actually have to further divide the networks into two specific categories, which is the traditional broadcasters and the streamers. Traditional broadcast companies include state-owned television stations, terrestrial broadcasters, cable TV, and satellite. And as everyone knows, these are kind of dying out, but for the moment they still exist and do commission a fair amount of animation. The way they make money is a combination of subscription-based revenue on their own broadcast network and cable bundles, then advertising revenue, which I don't want you to be confused with advertisers, which I'll explain later, and then finally, the licensing revenue based on the merchandise that they make for their shows. I want to make a quick side mention that I'm not specifically using a public broadcast right now for this analysis because those are nonprofits, so their entire structure is a little bit different. So just for the sake of length of video, I'm not including shows like or places like PBS and BBC. All right, so let's go to an example in traditional broadcast, which is Comedy Central. So when they first commissioned South Park, the ad revenue they were earning during the strongest season was something like $30 to $50 million per year. Now, if you consider at this time that South Park was producing about 15 to 18 shows per year, and the cost per episode was only like $500,000, that means that the show costs about $9 million plus another 2 to 3 in advertising, which is a total of about $12 million in cost per year. So if you subtract the amount they're making ad revenue, they're actually making $20 to $40 million in profit just from ad sales. Now, especially during this time when South Park was at its peak, it was also a merchandising monster. And I think some of the reporting I found listed that during some years, just for t-shirts, plush, and collectibles, it was making about $30 million. So to touch a little bit more on merchandising specifically for linear broadcasters, this is particularly effective and has been historically effective for the kids business, since the long, consistent runs of these shows on these linear traditional broadcast networks created strong fan familiarity and affinity that were rolled over into toy sales. So everyone remembers or knows about Transformers, He-Man, Ninja Turtles. These are the kind of shows that really worked in the 80s and 90s. But even relatively recently, back in 2012, when Nickelodeon purchased and revitalized the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle franchise, it earned $500 million in merch sales in the first years of its launch, and really created a resurgence in the brand that had been dormant since the mid-90s, except for maybe a single movie in 2003, which is actually pretty good. But again, these days might also be over, and the reason for that is because of the last category, which I'll talk about in the distributor category, which is the streamers. And talking about the streamers is where this gets really interesting, because the heart of the premise of this video, that really the long-form animated series is dead, might be because of the streamers. Basically, Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon, Apple, all of these companies in the streaming business commissioned a ton of animation during the peak TV period of 2012 to 2022. Their main goal was subscriber acquisition, which they got, and in many cases, this was really core to their business profitability analysis. But they also heavily overspent, and in overspending also introduced something called the cost plus model, which really in the end didn't work out for them. What cost plus first means is that the creators of the show are essentially boxed out from any extended royalties that you would normally get in traditional syndication. So to make up for this, the streamers would pay a higher premium upfront. That's the plus and the cost part. And then even more so, just pay a lot of money to make these really expensive looking shows in order to grab the attention of new customers who want to subscribe to these platforms. But once this was done and the shows made their run, no one ever got paid again. Additionally, without ad revenue, the sole benefit of the actual content was only the general increase of subscribers that, although anecdotally strong, were never really officially reported until recently. And so it was hard to make quantitative analysis of a show to say that, hey, this had a specific and measurable impact on the streamer's bottom line. I mean, ultimately, it's really hard to say that subscribers are staying because of Stranger Things or they're staying because of Arcane, because even though their viewership can be tracked and their minutes can be tracked, there's nothing saying that the customers are staying on the platform or leaving because of one show or another. Okay, lastly, with streamers, these series were actually released en masse. They were kind of dropped all at once to really give viewers the experience they were used to when they were binging these bulk syndicated shows, which is still to this day 50% of Netflix's programming. Because these series were dropped en masse, to give users the kind of experience they were used to with the kind of bulk syndication model of programs they would just watch for hours and hours, no animated series was able to gain any real fan affinity. And because there was no fan affinity, there was no merchandise. So really, to date, there has been no merchandise success on Netflix that compares to the types of franchises we knew in the traditional linear broadcast days. So, as everyone knows, since 2022, all the streamers pulled back on their commissions, and they really realized that this new ecosystem, although it looked great and feels great and was kind of good for customers, ultimately was not a healthy economy. It just broke the multi-layered business underpinnings that make the animated series format work. But I don't want to go too far into the industry is dead kind of video. So let's talk about really the final player in the traditional long-form animated series economy, and then finish up with two formats that actually still work. So if you watch the video this far and you understand some of the basic business flow I've talked about, you'll see how those series kind of work. All right, the last perspective to talk about, and the most important one in the animated series format, is the advertisers. Now, by advertisers, I mean any entity that is advertising their product via the mass marketing vehicle of animation. And this usually means the toy companies. The basic business here is that when a company actually has something they plan to sell en masse, they use an animated series as one big commercial. This was actually the predominant stereotype for cartoons when I was growing up, and probably a big part of the reason that even today, cartoons and toys are kind of always attached at the hip. Whether that's G.I. Joe or Transformers, Voltrons or Smurf, these classic cartoons really were paid for by the toy companies and then additionally sold to networks, which is more revenue, to literally just show their product in a story-based animated series that won the hearts and minds of all of us at the time and put billions and billions into the pockets of Hasbro, Mattel, and more. But again, as the streamers came to dominate the content distribution marketplace, especially in the subscriber-based video on demand or SVOD, and attention span started fragmenting to other areas like social media, Toy companies just were no longer seeing the kinds of returns on the model that they used to. Okay, so that's a lot of doom and gloom, but let's talk about two actually formats of long-form animated series that still work and briefly explain why. Here they are, the two formats that actually still work for long-form animation are preschool shows on YouTube and anime. To start with preschool, looking at the kinds of models and perspectives I've discussed, you can see how a series like Gabby's Dollhouse or Cocomelon or Baby Shark really broke through using a lot of the traditional wisdom, but mixing it up in a new way. Gabby's Dollhouse is a great case study because that was financed by a studio, DreamWorks, and then first backed by Spin Master, which became its master toy license and advertiser, and they put a significant amount of effort towards building a presence on YouTube first, which acted very much like a first window distribution. So before it went live on Netflix, it was constantly already aware in people's mind because it was being showed somewhere for free. This created a combination of consistency via the AVOD platform for the general fan affinity, and then longer story-based material on the SVOD, which essentially rolled over into merchandise sales. Now, by 2023, Gabby's Dollhouse actually became the second biggest preschool license in America. So you can see right there that the creator, the network, the advertiser, the studio all worked in unison to make the show a success. So to briefly talk about anime, the reason it still works as a long-form format is because, to begin with, it's actually a proven IP which is established in the marketplace of manga in Japan. Once this low-cost pre-marketing tool kind of discovers the right properties and greenlights it to series, a consortium of companies called a production committee actually puts together the financial model to make the show work. Now, I have a total other video about the business of anime, so I won't go too far into that, but the shorthand for now is that basically when an anime production committee is formed, it's really an elegant combination of the studio system, a consortium of licensed and merchandise partners, paid advertisers, and paid distributors to make everything kind of release at the same time. It also must be mentioned that anime's incredible selling point is that they're simply the only animated medium on the planet that offers the depth and the breadth and the epic amount of serial episodic works that take fans months and sometimes years to complete. So the fan affinity for these long-form stories is so strong that you have to believe that if you spent years watching some of these animated series, you're sure as hell going to buy the t-shirts and the posters and the figures that go along with it. And on top of that, those same production companies and those same anime consortiums are actually selling the live-action adaptations as well, which is another form of revenue. Okay, that's it. That's my explanation of why I think the animated format, long-form TV series is probably dead, explained a little bit by the underpinnings of how the business side works. I know that was a lot. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.